9:17 in the morning, January 22nd, 1943. A single rifle crack splits the jungle above Point Cruz, and 87 feet up in the branches of a banyan tree, a Japanese sniper jerks violently and drops. His body tumbles 90 feet through the canopy and slams into the jungle floor. 240 yards away, a 27-year-old crouched in the ruins of a captured bunker, works the bolt of his rifle, ejects the smoking cartridge, and searches for his next target. His name is John George. Until this morning, he had 0 confirmed kills. His fellow officers laughed at his weapon for 6 straight weeks. They called it a toy. A mail-order sweetheart. A rifle meant for shooting deer back home in Illinois, not for killing men trained to kill you first. In the next 4 days, that mocked civilian rifle would hunt down 11 Japanese snipers who had slaughtered 14 American soldiers in 72 hours. And the men who laughed would beg to watch him work. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next thrilling video. Join us as we uncover more forgotten stories, historic events, and inspiring moments from the past. Become part of our community. Now back to John George. To understand what made this morning possible, you have to understand Guadalcanal. By late December of 1942, the island had become a graveyard. The Marines had been fighting since August. They had bled to take Henderson Field, and they had bled to hold it. But they had not taken Mount Austin, and they had not cleared the Japanese from the coastal groves west of the Matanikau River. When the 132nd Infantry Regiment arrived to relieve the exhausted Marines, they inherited a nightmare the maps could not show. Mount Austin rose 1,514 feet into the sky, and the Japanese had turned it into a fortress they called the Gifu. 500 defenders, 47 bunkers. George's battalion attacked on December 17th and fought for 16 brutal days. They lost 34 men killed and 279 wounded before they finally seized the western slope on January 2nd. But the jungle around Point Cruz was a different kind of horror. No bunkers, no fixed lines, just Japanese soldiers who had melted back into the massive trees and vanished. Some of them were snipers with scoped Arisaka rifles, and they understood the jungle in ways no American did. They knew how to climb before dawn. They knew how to wait. On January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he filled canteens at a creek. On January 20th, 2 men from L Company died on patrol. On January 21st, 3 more were killed, 1 shot clean through the neck from a tree the patrol had walked past twice. The battalion was losing men faster to snipers than to malaria, and the officers had no answer. They had tried patrols. They had tried firepower. Nothing worked, but everything was about to change because of one man nobody had taken seriously. John George was no legend. He was 27 years old from Illinois, a National Guard shooter who had saved 2 years of pay to buy a single rifle. But behind the ordinary story was an extraordinary skill. In 1939, at just 23 years old, George had won the Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards, the youngest winner in the state's history. He could put 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards. He could shoot 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights. When most soldiers saw a distant shadow, George saw a target. Shooting was not a hobby for him. It was a language he spoke fluently, and he had spent thousands of hours learning to control his breathing, his heartbeat, and the smooth glass break of a perfect trigger pull. The problem was his weapon. At Camp Forest in Tennessee, George had unpacked a Winchester Model 70, fitted with a Lyman Alaskan scope and a Griffin and Howe mount. The armorer looked at it and asked whether it was meant for deer or Germans. George answered flatly, it was for the Japanese. Then the unit shipped out, and the rifle didn't. George spent the entire ocean voyage to Guadalcanal, watching other men clean their standard-issue Garans while his own weapon sat in a warehouse in Illinois. He had it forwarded through military mail, and 6 weeks later, in late December, a supply sergeant handed him a wooden crate stamped "Fragile." Inside was the rifle he had bet his reputation on. And then one fateful night, everything came to a head. To the men around him, George's idea was insane. Modern war was industrial, mass production, interchangeable parts. Every soldier carrying the identical 8-round semi-automatic M1 Garand. And here was George insisting on a 5-round bolt-action sporting rifle he had ordered through the mail. The Garand weighed 9.5 pounds and fired 8 rounds fast. George's Winchester weighed 9 pounds plus another 12 ounces for a scope that gave only 2.5 power magnification. In a firefight, the math looked suicidal. Captain Morris ordered George to leave the sporting rifle in his tent and carry a real weapon. The other platoon leaders mocked it as his mail-order sweetheart, a toy for a rich boy playing soldier. Every instinct in the United States Army said the future belonged to firepower, not to one man with a hunting rifle and a fragile scope. George carried it anyway. They did not understand what he understood. A Garand could spray bullets, but it could not reach out and touch a man 80 feet up a tree 200 yards away, hidden in shadow. That required precision. That required a scope, a match-grade barrel, and a shooter who had trained his entire life for exactly this. George didn't need 8 rounds. He needed 1. And what nobody in that battalion realized was that this quiet man's refusal to give up his mocked rifle was about to save the lives of dozens of American soldiers. The chance came on the night of January 21st. The battalion commander, desperate, summoned George to his tent. Men were dying and he needed someone who could shoot. He looked at the mail-order rifle and asked the obvious question, could that thing actually hit anything? George recited his credentials without emotion. State champion. 1,000 yards. 4-inch groups at 300. The commander gave him a single deadline. He had until morning to prove it. If George failed, the toy went back in the tent, and the killing would continue. George spent that entire night preparing in secret while the camp slept. The Winchester had been packed in thick cosmoline grease for the ocean voyage, so he stripped it down and cleaned every surface again. He checked the scope mounts with obsessive care, because a scope knocked even slightly out of alignment would send his shots wide and get him killed. He loaded 5 rounds of the .30-06 hunting ammunition he had personally packed back in Tennessee, the same cartridge the Garand fired. His hands were steady. His mind was clear. He was not thinking about 11 snipers. He was thinking about 1 shot at a time. At dawn on January 22nd, George moved alone into position inside the ruins of a Japanese bunker his battalion had captured 3 days earlier. No spotter. No radio man. Just a rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds in stripper clips. The bunker overlooked the coconut and banyan groves where intelligence said the snipers operated. Some of those banyan trees reached 90 feet tall, with trunks 8 feet thick. A man could climb one before sunrise and sit motionless all day invisible. George settled behind the sandbags and began to glass the canopy through his scope, slow and methodical, left to right, top to bottom, filtering out the birds and insects and distant artillery, hunting for the one thing that did not belong: movement. At 9:17, a branch shifted. No wind. Just a small, deliberate motion, 87 feet up 240 yards out. George watched. The branch moved again. Then the shape resolved in his scope, a man in dark clothing wedged in a fork, where 3 limbs met facing east, watching the supply trail. George adjusted 2 clicks right for wind. He controlled his breathing. The trigger broke like glass at 3.5 pounds. The Winchester slammed into his shoulder, the crack rolled through the jungle, and the sniper tumbled 90 feet to the earth. 1 shot, 1 kill. The mail-order toy had just done what an entire battalion could not. But George knew Japanese snipers worked in pairs. Somewhere close, a spotter was watching, and now he knew exactly where the American was. George scanned the surrounding banyans, forcing himself to search slowly through the weak magnification. At 9:43, he found him 60 yards north in a different tree, 50 feet up, already climbing down, already retreating. The man had heard the shot and knew his position was blown. George led the movement and fired. The second sniper pitched backward off the trunk, his rifle clattering through the branches ahead of him. Both bodies hit the jungle floor within seconds of each other. 2 shots, 2 kills, and George's hands never trembled. At 11:21, everything changed. A Japanese bullet smashed into the sandbag 6 inches from George's head, spraying dirt into his eyes. He rolled left and pressed himself flat against the bunker wall. This shot had come from the southwest, a new direction, a new hunter. Now George was no longer the only predator on the field. He waited 3 full minutes before easing back to his firing position. A trained sniper shoots and relocates, but in jungle this dense the options were limited. At 11:38, George found him 73 feet up in a cluster of 5 banyans, repositioned to a new branch, but still in the same tree. A mistake. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired. The third sniper fell without a sound. By noon on that first day, John George had killed 5 Japanese snipers. Word raced through the battalion like fire. The same men who had sneered at his mail-order rifle now crept forward and begged to watch him work. George refused every one of them. Spectators drew attention, and attention drew fire. He worked alone. The surviving snipers adapted after the 5th kill, freezing in place during daylight, and George spent a frustrating afternoon glassing empty trees. At 1600 hours, he returned to headquarters, and Captain Morris was waiting. The mockery was completely gone from his voice. He wanted George back in position at dawn. January 23rd opened under heavy tropical rain that drowned visibility past 100 yards. George sat in the bunker and waited, and when the rain broke at 8:15, he went back to work. At 9:12, he spotted a sniper who had climbed into position during the storm, using the noise of falling rain to mask his movement, and who had chosen a tree 290 yards out. Longer range, smarter. They were learning George's capabilities and trying to stay beyond them. George compensated for the distance and fired. The 6th sniper fell. That kill brought a response George had not expected. At 9:57, Japanese mortars began walking rounds toward his bunker. They had triangulated him by muzzle flash or sound. The first salvo landed 40 yards short. The second landed 20 yards short. The third would land directly on top of him. George snatched up his rifle and sprinted north along the tree line, diving into a shell crater, just as the bunker he had occupied seconds earlier vanished in a roar of fire and flying debris. This was no longer a shooting match. This was a duel, and the Japanese were now hunting him as hard as he was hunting them. He relocated to a fallen tree 120 yards north and kept working. At 14:23, he killed his 7th sniper. At 15:41, he killed his 8th, a man who had climbed 94 feet high for concealment, but whose silhouette betrayed him against the sky as the sun shifted. 8 confirmed kills. 12 rounds fired. 4 misses. When Morris demanded numbers that evening, George gave them without a trace of pride. That night, cleaning his Winchester by lamplight, George did the mathematics. 11 Japanese snipers had operated in the Point Cruz groves. 8 were now dead. 3 remained. And those 3 would be the best, the ones who had survived the longest by never making mistakes. Worse, they now knew exactly what George looked like, exactly where he liked to shoot from, and exactly what rifle he carried. He loaded 5 fresh rounds, laid the Winchester across his lap, and gave up on sleep at 3 in the morning. The mail-order rifle the whole battalion had laughed at had cleared 8 killers from a jungle no one else could touch. But the 3 remaining snipers were a different breed of enemy, patient, brilliant, and now personally hunting the American marksmen who had butchered their comrades. In Part 2, we will see the deadliest duel of George's life unfold, a battle of decoys, submerged ambushes, and a final confrontation that would leave John George trapped, outnumbered, and down to his last 2 rounds. But could one man with a 5-shot bolt-action rifle really outthink the finest snipers the Imperial Japanese Army had left? The answer will change everything you believe about one shooter and one rifle. By the end of January 23rd, John George had done the impossible. A 27-year-old marksman from Illinois, armed with a mail-order Winchester, the entire battalion had mocked as a toy, had killed 8 Japanese snipers in 2 days. 8 shooters who had terrorized the 132nd Infantry gone. 12 rounds fired. 4 misses. But 3 snipers remained in the Point Cruz groves, and those 3 were the survivors, the smartest, the most patient, the ones who never made mistakes. They now knew George's face. They knew his rifle. They knew where he liked to shoot from. And on the morning of January 24th, everything was about to get far more dangerous. George gave up on sleep at 3 in the morning and sat in his tent with the Winchester across his lap. Rain began falling at 4:15, heavy enough to delay any dawn operation. He used the darkness to do something the remaining snipers would not expect. He abandoned every position he had used before. Not the bunker, which was rubble now. Not the fallen tree. He crept 70 yards south to a cluster of large rocks the Marines had fortified into a machine gun nest back in December, a position with good cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. Then he waited for the rain to break. At 7:43, the downpour softened to a drizzle, and visibility crawled back. George began glassing the trees. At 8:17, he found sniper number 9 positioned in a palm tree, 190 yards out, only 40 feet up. Low. Too low. Most snipers climbed high for the sight lines, and this one had chosen concealment over elevation tucked into palm fronds that would be invisible from the jungle floor. But George was not on the jungle floor. He was elevated on the rocks, and the angle let him look down into the fronds. He could see the dark curve of the sniper's shoulders and the top of his head. George settled the crosshairs, controlled his breathing, and began to squeeze. Then he stopped. Something was wrong. The position was too obvious. Too easy. George had killed 8 men in 2 days, and he knew the arithmetic of survival. The 3 snipers still alive had outlasted their comrades precisely because they did not expose themselves in palm trees where an elevated American could spot them. Unless it was bait. George lowered the rifle and let the thought settle cold in his mind. If the man in the palm was a decoy, the real shooter would be positioned somewhere else, watching, waiting for George to fire, so the muzzle flash would give away his location. George began to glass the surrounding trees, slow and methodical, left to right, top to bottom, every tree within 300 yards of the palm. It took 11 minutes. At 8:28, he found the real threat. A banyan tree, 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up. A Japanese sniper, concealed in a perfect hide screened by branches and vines on 3 sides, his rifle aimed at George's old position by the fallen tree. He was waiting for George to appear where George had been yesterday, or for George to take the bait in the palm. And now, George faced 2 problems at once. If he fired at the hidden sniper, the report would betray his own position, and the man would relocate before George could work the bolt. But if he did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize George was not at the fallen tree and begin hunting for him. So George decided to use the enemy's own trap against them. He swung the Winchester back onto the decoy in the palm. He adjusted for wind. He fired. The decoy sniper jerked and dropped from the fronds, and in the same breath, George wrenched the rifle toward the banyan 91 feet up. The real sniper would react to the shot. He would turn toward the sound. That turn would make movement, and movement was death. George saw the shift, a slight repositioning, as the man rotated to face the new location, and George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired before the sniper could complete the turn. The real sniper fell. His rifle tumbled after him through the branches. 2 shots, 2 kills. Snipers 9 and 10 dead within seconds. But now anyone still watching knew exactly where George was. He grabbed his rifle and ammunition and ran. He sprinted east along the rock line and dove into a drainage ditch 40 yards away, pressing himself into the mud. At 8:34, Japanese machine gun fire raked the rocks he had occupied 6 seconds earlier, kicking up dust and stone fragments in a 17-second storm of lead. When it stopped, George counted to 60 before he moved. Then he relocated again 100 yards east, this time into a shell crater partially filled with cold rainwater. He lowered himself in until the water reached his chest, rested the Winchester on the crater rim, and resumed the hunt. 10 confirmed kills, 1 remaining, and the 11th sniper would be the best of them all. This man had watched 10 of his comrades die over 3 days. He knew George's tactics. He knew George's rifle. He knew George's approximate location. And George realized, scanning the empty canopy, that he had made an assumption that was about to get him killed. He had been searching the trees. But the 11th sniper was not in the trees. At 9:47, George caught movement at the very edge of his peripheral vision, 60 yards south, low to the ground. A shape sliding through the ferns and vines and fallen branches parallel to the tree line, crawling toward the rocks where George had been. The 11th sniper had watched the machine gun attack. He had seen George flee east, and now he was working his way along the most likely escape route, hunting George the exact way George had been hunting him. George went perfectly still in the water. The Winchester was already shouldered, his breathing controlled, but the crater rim blocked his view of the crawling man. To take the shot, he would have to rise up, and rising up would expose him. So George did the hardest thing a soldier can do: nothing. He waited. At 9:52, the sniper stopped 40 yards from the rocks and studied them, searching for any sign of his target. Then, at 9:58, he began to crawl again. 35 yards. 30. 25. He was approaching from the south side, the side George had used to escape closing on the machine gun nest. At 10:03, the sniper reached the rocks, slipped into the nest, and took up a position facing east, toward the drainage ditch toward where he believed George had relocated. He was now 38 yards from George's actual position in the water, and his back was completely exposed. George had a clear shot. Center mass. 38 yards. An easy kill even without a scope. But George hesitated. This man had survived 10 days of American operations. He had outlived 10 other snipers who died making mistakes. He would not blunder into a position this exposed and simply stay there. It had to be another decoy. George kept his scope on the sniper in the rocks, but expanded his awareness outward, and at 10:06, he found it. A second Japanese soldier 70 yards northwest, motionless behind a fallen tree trunk rifle, aimed at the drainage ditch where George should have been hiding. 2 men. The 11th sniper had brought support, and George could not shoot both before they reacted. The bolt-action Winchester needed a full second to cycle between shots. That second was all they needed to locate his muzzle flash and kill him. So George became invisible. He lowered himself deeper into the water, submerging until only his eyes and the crown of his head broke the surface, holding the Winchester vertically to keep water out of the barrel. And he waited. At 10:13, the sniper in the rocks stood up. 10 minutes of watching had shown him nothing, and he had decided George was farther east. He signaled his partner behind the fallen tree, and both men began to move east parallel 70 yards apart, executing a sweep to flush George out. They passed his crater. They put their backs to him, positioning themselves between George and the tree line. George rose from the water, slowly, silently, water sheeting off the barrel and his uniform and his face. He brought the Winchester up and aimed at the nearer soldier, the one from the rocks now 42 yards away. He fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt chambered swung to the second man who was already turning, already raising his rifle. George fired first. The second soldier fell. 11 shots fired over 3 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. George had cleared the Point Cruz groves of a threat that had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours, a threat an entire battalion could not touch in 2 weeks. And then he heard the voices. Japanese voices coming from the tree line, moving toward the 2 dead men. George dropped back into the water and submerged until only his eyes showed the Winchester held vertical. The voices grew. At least 6 men, maybe more, branches breaking, equipment rattling. These were not snipers. These were infantry, a patrol, or a recovery team sent to collect the bodies. They stopped at the first corpse, 42 yards from his crater, close enough that he could hear every urgent word without understanding one of them. Then they moved to the second body. And at 10:28, they began moving again, not back toward the trees, but toward his crater. They had found his tracks, boot prints in the mud leading from the rocks straight to the water. George had 5 rounds. There were at least 6 of them. Poor odds for a bolt-action rifle against infantry. The voices closed. 30 yards. 25. 20. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim and looked straight down into George's eyes. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. George worked the bolt while still submerged, rose up, and 2 more men were at the rim. He fired, cycled, fired again. Both dropped. 3 rounds left. Shouting now, more soldiers converging. George hauled himself out the north side of the crater, ran 20 yards, and threw himself behind a fallen tree as Japanese rifle fire cracked through the jungle bullets, snapping into the dirt and the wood around him. They were firing at movement and sound, not confirmed targets. George glassed the area, saw 2 soldiers advancing at 50 yards, aimed at the lead man, and fired. The soldier dropped. The second dove for cover. 2 rounds left, and no stripper clips, because the clips were in his pack, and the pack was somewhere back by the water-filled crater. Then he heard voices behind him, too. They were flanking one group from the south, one from the east. George was about to be surrounded, and he understood with total clarity that he could not win a firefight with a 5-shot bolt gun against infantry carrying semi-automatic weapons. He had to break contact. He grabbed the Winchester and ran north, sprinting through undergrowth that clawed at his boots, and whipped his face Japanese fire, chasing him, bullets snapping past and striking trees. He ran for 90 seconds before diving into a dry shell crater and pressing himself against the wall, listening. The voices were distant now. They had not pursued. They were regrouping around their dead. At 10:47, George began moving again, not running now, walking low, using the terrain, working northeast. At 11:13, he reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him, and George identified himself and was led through. He walked to battalion headquarters and reported to Captain Morris, the same Captain Morris who had ordered him to leave the sporting rifle in his tent. The debrief was precise. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days. 12 rounds fired against the snipers, 11 hits. Then a firefight with infantry, 3 more kills, 5 rounds. Morris asked about ammunition. George was down to 2 rounds. Morris asked about the rifle. George said it was functional, but fouled with mud and water. Morris told him to clean it and rest. No operations tomorrow. The battalion was moving east. The Japanese were evacuating Guadalcanal, and intelligence said the withdrawal would be complete within 2 weeks. George went back to his tent field, stripped the Winchester, and spent 2 hours cleaning every component before loading 5 fresh rounds. And that afternoon, everything he had done in the trees was about to change his war entirely, because he had found an unexpected ally in the last place he expected. At 1400 hours, word came down from division. The regimental commander wanted to see him. George walked to headquarters, half convinced Morris had filed a negative report. Unauthorized engagement, excessive ammunition expenditure, operating alone without support. The Army had no formal position for what George had done. No line in the table of organization for a lone marksman with a mail-order rifle, and men who broke the mold got disciplined, not decorated. Instead, George found Morris and 2 other officers waiting, and one of them was Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry had watched 14 men die to snipers in 3 days. He had watched one man with a hunting rifle end the threat in 4. He did not care that the Winchester was not regulation. He cared that it worked. And he asked George one question. "Could you train other men to do what you did?" George considered it. "I can try," he said, "but it would take time, and rifles with optics, and men who can already shoot." Ferry could supply all 3. Division had 14 Springfield rifles fitted with unertl target scopes left behind by the Marines, and Ferry had 40 men in the regiment who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. He wanted George to build a sniper section, train those men, develop tactics, and clear any remaining Japanese shooters from American operational areas. George accepted. He had one condition. He wanted to keep his Winchester. Ferry approved it on the spot. Training began on January 27th at a makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. 40 men, expert marksmen on paper, qualified with iron sights out to 500 yards. But not one of them had ever killed a man from concealment. George started with the fundamentals that had kept him alive in the trees: breathing control, trigger squeeze, reading wind. The scoped Springfields weighed 11 pounds heavier than his Winchester stable, but exhausting to hold for hours, so George taught them to build a stable platform from anything: rocks, logs, sandbags, because the jungle never offered a perfect position, and the man who waited for one died waiting. Range work lasted 3 days. Stationary targets from 100 to 400 yards. Then moving targets. Then targets half hidden by vegetation. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 men could consistently hit a man-sized target at 300 yards under field conditions. George split them into 16 two-man teams, a shooter and a spotter, the spotter carrying binoculars and a garand to locate targets and provide security. After each kill, the roles could switch, keeping both men sharp and eliminating the single point of failure that came from relying on one shooter. It was everything George had done alone in the trees multiplied by 16. On February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field. Their mission was to clear Japanese positions west of the Matanikau River stragglers and infantry who had not yet evacuated. The teams moved into position at dawn, and George paired with a spotter named Corporal Hayes on high ground above a resupply trail. At 7:20, a Japanese soldier appeared. Hayes confirmed the target through his binoculars. George fired. The soldier dropped. Over the next 6 hours, George's team engaged 7 more 6 kills, 1 miss to wind, and the other 3 teams reported the same. 23 Japanese soldiers killed that day. 0 American casualties. The contrast was staggering. Before George snipers had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours, and the battalion had no answer. After George, 16 American teams were killing dozens of Japanese and losing no one. The section continued operating through early February, and by February 9th, it had accumulated 74 confirmed kills, a conservative count that included only bodies the teams could actually observe. The Japanese covering the evacuation began dying faster than they could pull back, cut down at ranges where they never saw the shooter by an enemy that had learned to hunt them in their own jungle. An idea the entire army had laughed at 4 days earlier was now official doctrine, blessed by a colonel and recommended for a Bronze Star. The mail-order rifle had not just cleared the groves. It had built a killing machine, but George's war was not finished. While the sniper section racked up kills and the Japanese abandoned Guadalcanal for good orders were moving through Pacific Command orders that would pull George off this island and send him somewhere far worse. The Army needed experienced combat officers for a new mission. Something in Burma. Something classified. Something that would demand not a single marksman clearing a coconut grove, but a rifleman capable of surviving 700 miles of enemy territory deep behind Japanese lines with no supply, no support, and no way out. They were building a unit with no official name yet. 3,000 men who would call themselves Merrill's Marauders. And John George and his Winchester Model 70 were about to march into the deadliest jungle campaign of the entire Pacific War, where the rifle that made him a legend at Point Cruz would face a test that mocking officers and 11 dead snipers had never dreamed of. A mail-order Winchester the entire battalion had mocked as a toy had killed 11 Japanese snipers in 4 days, then built a 16-team sniper section that racked up 74 confirmed kills with 0 American losses. John George had turned a joke into doctrine. And then the war took him somewhere the rules of Point Cruz no longer applied. Burma. 700 miles of the deadliest jungle on Earth, behind Japanese lines, no supply, no support, no way out. The Japanese had 4,000 troops guarding the objective and considered the terrain impassable for any large force. They were about to learn how wrong they were. And now this was no longer an experiment. The unit had no official designation when George joined it in India in April of 1943. The men called themselves Merrill's Marauders. On paper, They were the 5,307th Composite Unit, 3,000 volunteers trained in long-range penetration jungle survival and operations without supply lines. The model was the British Chindits, small mobile forces that could vanish into enemy territory and strike where no one expected. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion as a rifle platoon leader because the Army still had no formal slot for a sniper. But Colonel Ferry's recommendation had followed him from Guadalcanal, and battalion command knew exactly what this quiet officer could do with a scoped rifle. The Japanese did not yet understand what was coming. Their commanders in northern Burma had built their entire defense around a single assumption. No large Allied force could cross the Kumon Range, ford the rivers, and move through jungle with no roads and only game trails. They guarded the roads. They guarded the obvious approaches to Myitkyina and its critical airfield, the prize that controlled Allied supply routes into China. What they did not guard was the impossible, and the impossible was precisely the route the marauders would take. George prepared his weapon for a different kind of war. On Guadalcanal, he had fought at short range with regular resupply. Burma meant patrols lasting weeks, hundreds of miles on foot, every ounce a burden. He stripped the heavy Lyman Alaskan scope off the Winchester and replaced it with a lighter Weaver, 3.3. Same 2.5 power magnification, 8 ounces lighter. He swapped the wooden stock for a lighter synthetic version. The modifications dropped the rifle from 9 pounds 12 ounces to 8 pounds 14 ounces. Under a 60-pound load across a 200-mile march, that difference mattered more than any officer at Camp Forest would ever have believed. The marauders crossed into Burma in February of 1944. The march itself became the first enemy. The opening week covered 83 miles through mountainous jungle so steep that pack mules broke their legs on the descents and had to be shot. Men collapsed from heat and exhaustion. Malaria spread through the ranks daily. By March, the battalion had covered 217 miles and engaged Japanese forces. 12 times quick ambushes and firefights, followed by rapid withdrawal. The marauders were never meant to hold ground. They were meant to move to harass, to cut supply lines, and spread chaos deep behind the enemy's front. And the Japanese began to notice they were bleeding from a wound they could not locate. Their supply columns were being hit in places no Allied force should have been able to reach. Officers directing troops at river crossings dropped dead from a single shot, fired from an impossible distance, and no one heard a second shot to fix the shooter's position. Japanese commanders convened urgent conferences over a threat they could not see. They knew the Chindit tactics from the previous year. What unsettled them was the precision. George used the Winchester 3 times during the march. Once at 412 yards against a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing. Once at 380 yards against a machine gun position. Once at 290 yards against a sniper who had pinned down a marauder patrol. 3 shots. 3 kills. He never fired more than once per engagement. That single-shot discipline was a weapon in itself. The Winchester's report was distinctive, deeper and different from the sharp crack of the Garand. 1 shot announced his presence, and a second would give the Japanese the seconds they needed to triangulate him. So George shot once and moved immediately every time, and to the enemy it seemed as if death arrived from nowhere and left no trace. But this was not the only threat closing in on the marauders. Something far more dangerous than any Japanese sniper was hunting the entire column, and it could not be shot. The jungle itself was killing them. Disease tore through the marauders faster than combat ever could. Malaria, dysentery, typhus. The unit that had entered Burma at full strength was hemorrhaging men who never fired a shot, dropping in the mud with fevers that spiked past 104 degrees. There was no evacuation. No field hospital waiting behind the lines because there were no lines. A sick man walked or a sick man was left, and being left meant death. The pack mules that carried the mortars and ammunition were dying too, and every dead mule meant weapons and supplies abandoned on the trail. The marauders were wasting away with each mile, and the objective was still far ahead. The internal strain grew as fast as the sick lists. Long-range penetration doctrine looked brilliant on a planner's map in India. On the ground, it meant men marching themselves to death with no rest and no relief, carrying their own wounded, watching friends collapse. There were officers who questioned whether the whole concept was a catastrophic mistake, whether these 3,000 men had been sent to die for an airfield. The doubt was reasonable. The math was brutal. The unit that crossed into Burma began to shrink toward a number that would soon make it combat ineffective, and every hard day raised the same silent question in every exhausted mind. Was this worth it? Then came Myitkyina, and every doubt was answered at once. By late May, the marauders had covered over 700 miles. They had done the impossible crossing terrain the Japanese swore no army could cross, and now they stood at the objective that justified every death on the trail. The Myitkyina airfield. The key to the entire northern Burma campaign, the linchpin of Allied supply into China. The Japanese had built their defense on the certainty that no significant force could ever approach it overland. And on the morning of May 17, 1944, that certainty shattered. The marauders struck the airfield. Speed was everything now. The Japanese garrison had oriented its defenses toward the roads, toward the expected threats, and the marauders came from the direction that was supposed to be impassable. The assault hit before the defenders could reorient. Men who had marched 700 miles on fevered legs found one last reserve of strength and threw themselves at the runway. Mortars dropped. Rifles cracked. The Japanese, stunned by an attack from a direction their commanders had ruled out, could not mount an organized defense in time. George moved with the assault. The airfield was chaos, but chaos was where a marksman earned his pay. Japanese soldiers rushing to defensive positions, officers trying to rally scattered men, machine gun crews scrambling to set up. George found the targets that mattered most. The officer waving men into a firing line. The gunner settling behind a weapon that could rake the advancing marauders. One shot. Move. Another shot. Move. Each precise round removed a piece of the enemy's ability to coordinate, and the Japanese defense, already reeling from the shock of the direction, began to come apart at the seams. By the end of the day, the airfield was in American hands. The seizure of Myitkyina airfield was one of the most significant Allied achievements in the entire Burma campaign. It opened the door for reinforcements to be flown directly in. It secured the supply route into China that the whole northern offensive had been fighting for. And it had been accomplished by a unit that walked 700 miles through terrain the Japanese had declared impossible, striking a garrison that never believed the attack could come. The Japanese command, which had staked its defense on the impassability of the jungle, now faced the collapse of that assumption and the loss of a position they considered secure. The psychological blow matched the strategic one. Their front in northern Burma had been unhinged from behind by ghosts who should not have been able to reach them. But the victory carried a devastating price, and word of what it had cost spread as fast as the news of the triumph. The marauders had won, but the unit that took Myitkyina was a shadow of the force that entered Burma. The 3-month campaign had ground them down through combat, and far more through disease and exhaustion. Fewer than 3,000 men remained fit for duty, and even that number was collapsing. The unit was, in the cold language of the Army combat, ineffective. Too many casualties. Too many sick. Too long in the jungle with no rest and no proper medical care. They had accomplished their mission and destroyed themselves doing it. The very success at Myitkyina became the final chapter of Merrill's marauders as a fighting force. George survived. His Winchester survived. But the Burma campaign had taught the state champion from Illinois a lesson that point crews never could. In 3 months of operations, he had used the scoped rifle only 7 times. The long-range precision shooting that made the Winchester lethal on Guadalcanal was rare here. Most Burma combat was close-range ambush at 50 yards or less, firefights in vegetation, so dense a man could barely see 30 feet chaos, where a 5-round bolt-action gun was a liability against the 8-round semi-automatic Garand. The rifle that made him a legend in the coconut groves had spent most of Burma slung across his back, and George understood what that meant. The Winchester Model 70 was perhaps the finest bolt-action sporting rifle ever made. But modern warfare was changing under his feet. The individual craftsman marksman with his privately owned rifle belonged to a fading world. The future belonged to mass-production standardization semi-automatic firepower soldiers with identical weapons and identical training. He had proven at Point Cruz that one man with the right rifle and the right skill could change the course of a battle. Burma had shown him that such moments were becoming the exception, not the rule. The reckoning came fast. By June of 1944, George was evacuated from Burma with the rest of the shattered marauders. The unit was disbanded, its survivors folded into other commands or sent home to recover. George never fired his Winchester in combat again. The rifle that had crossed from Illinois to Tennessee, to Guadalcanal, to India to Burma had reached the end of its war. The Army promoted George to captain and reassigned him to Fort Benning, Georgia, to train infantry officers in the very skills he had refined in the field marksmanship, small unit tactics, how to move through jungle and engage targets at distance and operate alone without supply. The numbers when the dust settled told the whole story. On Guadalcanal, a single marksman had ended a sniper threat that killed 14 Americans in 72 hours and had built a section that killed 74 Japanese for 0 friendly losses. In Burma, 3,000 men had marched 700 impossible miles, engaged the enemy again and again, and seized the airfield that unlocked the supply line into China, breaking a Japanese defense built on the belief that such a march could never happen. 2 campaigns. 2 proofs that skill, will, and the right weapon in the right hands could overturn every assumption the enemy made. And at the center of both stood one man and one rifle that officers had once laughed at. Colonel Ferry had recommended George for a Bronze Star after Guadalcanal. By the war's end, George would carry more than that. 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart from the bullet that had punched through his shoulder near the Tanambogo River, a combat infantry badge, the rank of lieutenant colonel. Recognition hard-earned for a soldier who had insisted on doing things his own way and had been proven right at the cost of blood and the edge of his own endurance. But the rifle's story and George's was far from over. Because the man who had killed 11 snipers in 4 days and helped take an impossible airfield would spend the rest of his life in a way almost no one who watched him work would ever have predicted. He would not fade into obscurity, and he would not chase glory. What John George did after the war, and what happened to the mail-order Winchester that officers once called a toy, is the final chapter of this story, and it is the part that almost no one knows. His war was ending. His legend was only beginning to be written down. And where that rifle rests today, and what it came to prove about the nature of skill in modern war, is a truth that deserves to be remembered. A state champion marksman with a mail-order rifle his own officers called a toy. 11 Japanese snipers hunted down in 4 days. A 16-team sniper section that killed 74 enemy soldiers for 0 American losses. 700 impossible miles through the Burma jungle to seize an airfield the Japanese swore could never be reached. John George had proven again and again that one man with the right skill and the right rifle could rewrite the assumptions of an entire war. But what happened to the man himself when the shooting stopped? Because this story has a final twist that almost no one saw coming. And it reveals that George's greatest weapon was never the Winchester at all. Success, it turns out, sometimes comes with a price nobody expects, and a legacy nobody planned. When the war ended, John George did not fade into the bitter obscurity that swallowed so many combat soldiers. But he did not chase the spotlight either. He returned to the United States in July of 1944, promoted to captain, and the Army sent him to Fort Benning, Georgia. His new mission was to teach. He stood before rooms of young infantry officers and passed on everything the jungles of Guadalcanal and Burma had burned into him. How to move through dense terrain. How to identify and engage a target at distance. How to operate alone without supply, without support, without anyone coming to save you. The man who had once been mocked for his rifle was now the instructor other men were ordered to listen to. He kept the Winchester. The rifle had traveled from a gun shop in Illinois to Camp Forest in Tennessee, across the ocean to Guadalcanal, onto India, into the depths of Burma, and finally back home to Georgia. It had killed at least 14 enemy soldiers in confirmed engagements, and almost certainly more that could never be counted. But at Fort Benning, it sat quietly in a footlocker in his quarters. George rarely took it out. He understood better than anyone that the war which had made his rifle legendary was already passing into history, and that the age of the individual craftsman-marksman was ending. His decorations told part of the story. 2 bronze stars, a Purple Heart for the bullet that tore through his shoulder near the Tanambogo River, the Combat Infantry Badge. By the time he was discharged in January of 1947, he had risen to lieutenant colonel. The officers who had laughed at his mail-order sweetheart, who had called it a toy for shooting deer, had been answered not by argument, but by results. Captain Morris, who once ordered George to leave the sporting rifle in his tent, had ended up sending a runner to bring him back to the front. Colonel Ferry, who gave him 14 scoped Springfields and 40 men, had recommended him for the medal that started it all. And then George did the last thing anyone expected of a man who had killed so efficiently. He walked away from war entirely and became a scholar. He enrolled at Princeton University on the GI Bill and studied politics, graduating with highest honors in 1950. From Princeton, he went to Oxford for 4 years, then spent 4 more years in British East Africa, studying regional politics and institutions on a continent that had nothing to do with jungle warfare. He settled in Washington, D.C. as executive director of the Institute of African American Relations, and later joined the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute as a consultant and lecturer on African affairs. The sniper of Point Cruz had become a diplomat, an academic, a man whose colleagues discussed development policy and constitutional structures across conference tables. For years, those colleagues had no idea. They knew he had served in the Pacific. They did not know about the 11 snipers. They did not know about the water-filled crater or the decoy in the palm tree or the 700 miles to Mayetkina. They did not know that in a case somewhere in his home rested a Winchester Model 70 that had done things no Army rifle manual would ever describe. The man who could have dined out on his war stories for the rest of his life instead kept them almost entirely to himself. But his true legacy would not be found in his medals or his diplomatic titles or even in the rifle itself. It would be found in something he did with a pencil and 400 sheets of paper. In 1947, before Princeton, before Oxford, George sat down to write. Not for fame, not for money. He wanted to document what he had seen while the details were still sharp in his mind, the weapons, the tactics, the hard-won truths of jungle combat. He wrote for 6 months, and the manuscript grew past 400 pages of clinical, unsentimental observation. There was no hero worship in it, no embellishment, just precise descriptions of what worked in combat and what got men killed, written by someone who had learned the difference at the closest possible range. A friend at the National Rifle Association read the manuscript and urged him to publish. George resisted. The book was technical dense with ballistics and rifle specifications, hardly the stuff of bestsellers. But the NRA prevailed, and in 1947, the book appeared under a title that captured everything about the man who wrote it. Shots Fired in Anger. It became a classic among firearms enthusiasts, military historians, and collectors. George's descriptions of Japanese weapons remain some of the most detailed first-hand accounts ever recorded. And the book is still in print today, still consulted as a reference decades after the war that produced it. That was the real legacy. Not the kills, but the knowledge preserved so that others might learn. Because the deeper truth of George's story was never about a single rifle. It was about an idea, and that idea outlived him by generations. George had proven something the American military spent the next 50 years slowly institutionalizing. That a trained marksman with a precision rifle and a scope operating with patience and independence could produce results out of all proportion to his numbers. On Guadalcanal, this was heresy. The Army had no formal sniper program, no dedicated training, no slot in its table of organization for what George did. He had to improvise the entire discipline from his own civilian competition background, teaching 40 men from scratch on a makeshift range near Henderson Field. But the concept he demonstrated would not stay buried. In Korea, only a few years later, American forces were relearning the value of trained snipers against an enemy that used the mountainous terrain much as the Japanese had used the jungle. In Vietnam, sniping finally began to mature into a formal military specialty, with dedicated schools, dedicated equipment, and marksmen, whose confirmed records would eventually eclipse anything from the Second World War. The Marine Corps and the Army built sustained sniper programs, complete with the two-man shooter and spotter team structure that George had improvised on Guadalcanal out of pure necessity. The idea he had been mocked for became doctrine taught in classrooms, and it never stopped evolving. George lived long enough to watch the American military rifle transform from the Garand he once refused to the M14 to the M16. He watched precision rifles grow scopes far more powerful than his humble 2.5 power Weaver. He watched ranges that would have seemed fantastical at Point Cruz become routine for modern military snipers, equipped with match-grade rifles, advanced optics, and ballistic computers. Yet underneath all that technology lived the same principle George had staked his reputation on in 1943. One skilled shooter, patient and precise, could change the shape of a battle. The tools grew unrecognizable. The core idea remained exactly what he had proven in a captured bunker west of Point Cruz. But the largest lesson of George's story was never really about rifles or scopes or sniper doctrine at all. It was about where good ideas come from and how badly institutions resist them. George was not a weapons designer or a general. He was, in the terms the Army used, an ordinary reserve officer with an unusual hobby. His breakthrough came not from military research, but from civilian marksmanship competition, from thousands of hours spent at ranges like Camp Perry, perfecting a skill the Army did not value. The idea that a mail-order sporting rifle could outperform trained enemy snipers was to nearly every officer around him insane. And their resistance was not stupidity. It was the natural reflex of a large institution built on standardization, mass production, and interchangeable parts, an institution for which one man's custom rifle was an inconvenience, not an asset. That tension runs through the entire history of military innovation. The tank was resisted by cavalry officers who could not imagine machines replacing horses. The aircraft carrier was doubted by admirals wedded to the battleship right up until carrier planes sank battleships and rewrote naval warfare in an afternoon. Radar, the submarine. The very idea of long-range penetration units like the Marauders George served in, all faced the same wall of institutional skepticism before proving themselves. George's Winchester belongs on that list, not because it was a war-winning superweapon, but because it demonstrated a truth that powerful organizations forget again and again. The person who sees the answer is often the one standing lowest in the hierarchy, holding a tool everyone else has dismissed. And that truth is not confined to history books or battlefields. It plays out today in every laboratory, every company, every institution, where a junior voice sees something the experts have overlooked. The engineer whose strange idea gets laughed out of the meeting. The analyst whose warning nobody wants to hear. The outsider who solves the problem the specialists declared unsolvable. George's story is a reminder, written in the hardest possible circumstances, that dismissing an idea because of who it comes from or how unconventional it looks is one of the oldest and most expensive mistakes there is. But there is one final detail in this story that almost no one knows, a detail that gives the entire legend its perfect ending. The rifle survived. All of it. The mocking, the ocean voyages, the mud of Guadalcanal, the Cosmoline, and the rain, the 700 miles of Burma jungle, the water-filled crater where George submerged himself with only his eyes above the surface. Through every one of those trials, the Winchester Model 70 endured. And when John George died on January 3, 2009, at the age of 90, That rifle did not vanish into a family attic or an anonymous estate sale. It was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia, where it rests today in a display case behind glass. Here is the quiet twist that completes the story. Most visitors walk straight past it. They see a vintage hunting rifle, an ordinary-looking bolt-action gun with a modest scope indistinguishable from thousands of sporting rifles hanging over fireplaces across America. There is nothing about its worn appearance that announces what it did. The placard tells the history, but the eyes slide past. The very ordinariness that made George's officers dismiss it in 1943 is the same ordinariness that makes museum visitors overlook it now. The rifle that cleared the Point Cruz groves in 4 days, when an entire battalion could not do it in 2 weeks, sits unremarked in plain sight, still being underestimated decades after it proved every skeptic wrong. And perhaps that is the most fitting monument imaginable. A weapon that was always underestimated resting behind glass, still quietly being underestimated by nearly everyone who passes. It does not need to announce itself. Its record speaks for anyone willing to stop and read it. The rifle that proved a state champion with a mail-order scope could outshoot professionally trained military snipers. The rifle that demonstrated how a single skilled man could accomplish what massed firepower could not. The rifle that helped change how the American military would think about individual marksmanship for the rest of the century. From an ordinary reserve officer with a rifle, his superiors called a toy, to a legend who cleared 11 enemy snipers in 4 days, built a sniper section that killed 74 for 0 losses, marched 700 impossible miles to help seize a critical airfield, and then wrote the book that preserved those lessons for every generation that followed. John George proved that skill, courage, and the willingness to be laughed at can overturn every assumption the powerful hold as certain. He never sought glory. He simply refused to leave his rifle in the tent. And that is the enduring power of this story. Not the confirmed kills, staggering as they were. Not the medals, or the airfield, or the 400 pages he wrote by hand. It is the reminder that the next battle-changing idea, the next breakthrough that saves lives and rewrites the rules, may right now be sitting in the hands of someone the experts have dismissed someone holding a tool everyone else calls a toy. The men who mocked John George have been forgotten. The rifle they laughed at sits in a museum, and the quiet marksman who trusted his own skill over every voice telling him he was wrong became the one whose name deserves to be remembered. Because in the end, the greatest weapon he ever carried was not the Winchester. It was the courage to believe he was right when everyone insisted he was insane.